Defensive issue linkage, exploring the origins of environmental content in trade agreements. Issue linkage is a well-documented and prominent phenomenon in international relations. Issue linkage describes a situation in which two issues that were historically treated separately become politically linked. Issue linkage, such as two areas that have become increasingly intertwined over the last 30 years, are trade policy and the environment. Before the 1990s, trade and environmental policies operated largely separately for centuries. The political connection between trade and environmental policy has grown significantly since 1990. A recent study by Christina Tonshoff introduces defensive issue linkage as a mechanism behind this growth. As trade laws expanded, they began to affect environmental policies, prompting environmental groups to mobilize for policy exceptions. These groups' opposition led to the inclusion of proactive environmental clauses in trade agreements. Policymakers introduced these clauses to strengthen ratifying coalitions. Evidence from the US, EU, and Malaysia shows how environmental groups react to expanding trade policies, influencing trade agreement content. A quantitative analysis of preferential trade agreements from 1989 to 2016 supports the defensive issue linkage theory. Issue linkage in international relations is when two policy issues become connected. The linkage between trade policy and the environment has been growing since the WTO's formation in 1995. Environmental clauses have become more common and stringent in trade agreements. The new NAFTA, or USMCA, had to include improved environmental provisions to gain approval. Recent multi-regional deals also saw significant protests from environmental organizations. Existing theories suggest that trade-environment linkages spread environmentalism abroad or act as veiled protectionism. This paper proposes that environmental groups view the expansion of trade policies as a threat to environmental policies and mobilize in response. Environmental groups demand to preserve policy space for environmental measures. Policymakers introduce proactive environmental measures to counter opposition. These measures help satisfy left-leaning policymakers and the environmentally minded public. This paper identifies the importance of environmental NGOs in shaping trade agreement content. It shows that as one issue area expands, it can trigger more issue linkages by mobilizing new interest groups. Environmental content in trade agreements often arises from demands for policy sovereignty. Prior work distinguishes between substantive and tactical issue linkages. Some linkages are tactical, using trade policy to push for better environmental performance abroad. Powerful countries like the US and EU use trade policy strategically to encourage environmental changes in other countries. Substantive linkages result from recognizing logical connections between trade and the environment. Trade integration can impact the environment, and environmental regulations can affect trade. As trade agreements expand, they increasingly include clauses affecting environmental policy. Trade-environment linkage is an example of regime complexity where multiple overlapping institutions interact. Environmental provisions in trade agreements can be defensive or offensive. Defensive provisions protect governments' policy space for environmental regulations. Offensive provisions mandate specific environmental policies. Defensive provisions are more common, aiming to preserve regulatory space. The interest group dynamics behind these provisions are not well detailed in prior studies. Business interests and veiled protectionism have been identified as drivers of environmental content in trade policy. Companies may favor strict environmental standards to reduce foreign competition or level the playing field for exports. Empirical evidence supports the idea of environmental provisions as veiled protectionism. Democracies use non-tariff barriers for protectionism, and countries with majoritarian systems include enforceable environmental provisions due to protectionist interests. Import competition is associated with more environmental clauses in trade agreements. Countries with better environmental performance and thus lower compliance costs include more environmental provisions. Previous inclusion of similar provisions also makes countries more likely to include them again. Environmental NGOs began mobilizing around trade in the early 1990s. They aim to spread stricter environmental norms abroad and preserve their home government's rights to impose strict regulations. A sense of threat can motivate environmental NGO mobilization around trade. There is limited systematic research on the specific interests driving environmental NGO mobilization around trade. The study by Christina Lowenschhoff fills that gap by exploring the origins of environmental content in trade agreements through the lens of defensive issue linkage.